Hello, welcome to our channel, Season 3 Reconstruction. Here are our 3 hosts of this historical podcast series. I'm Emily, the narrator.
I'm Ashley, the scriptwriter.
And I'm Isabella, the lead researcher.
In this season, each of the 3 episodes will discuss each of the amendments, the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th, that affected the Reconstruction period. The Reconstruction era, carried out by Congress from 1866 to 77, aimed to restructure the states in the South soon after the Civil War. Although the Reconstruction era established greater racial equality than before, such as giving African Americans the freedom and the right to vote through the Reconstruction Amendments, these amendments ran into many problems. Southern states enforced discriminatory state laws against African Americans that restricted their rights. These civil rights issues continue past the Reconstruction era and still affect us today. First of all, let's head off to the Civil War.
What is the Civil War's connection to Reconstruction?
The Civil War, also known as the American Civil War, was a crucial armed conflict that took place in the United States from 1861 to 1865. The Civil War was a fight between the northern states and the southern states. The northern states were also known as the Union, while the southern states were also known as the Confederate States of America. The Confederate States had left the Union in 1860 due to the conflicts regarding slavery, which later became the primary cause of the Civil War. The primary cause was that the enslavers in the South initiated the Civil War in an attempt to preserve enslavement.
How did the Civil War begin and who won the war?
The Civil War began with the Confederate forces attacking Fort Sumter in 1861, and it ended with their surrender in 1865. The Union's victory over the Confederate forces was mostly due to their superior resources like manpower, transportation, industrial capacity, and the effective leadership demonstrated by President Abraham Lincoln and the military strategies employed by General Ulysses S. Grant. By the end of the Civil War, it brought freedom to enslaved African Americans in the former Confederacy.
How did the Civil War initiate the Reconstruction?
The Civil War led to the Reconstruction period because the U.S. wanted to restructure the South and protect the rights of the newly freed African Americans. Although some might argue that Reconstruction period made significant progress in some areas, it ultimately ended without fully achieving its goals, and the struggle for civil rights and racial equality continued for many decades afterwards.
Now that we know the causes of Reconstruction, let us get deeper into the first episode, the 13th Amendment.
To begin with, the 13th Amendment primary goal was to abolish slavery completely.
Quoting the 13th Amendment from the United States Constitution Amendment, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States, or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation.
The 13th Amendment involved events like Emancipation Proclamation, Freedmen's Bureau, and Black Codes.
First of all, the Emancipation Proclamation was an announcement issued by President Abraham Lincoln and was announced in the third year of the bloody Civil War. And President Lincoln declared that all persons held as slaves within the rebellious states are, and henceforward shall be free.
Quick question, why was the 13th Amendment needed if we had the Emancipation Proclamation?
The 13th Amendment was in response to the fact that the Emancipation Proclamation did not actually free enslaved people since the southern states didn't acknowledge it, and it didn't impact enslaved people in the broader states. So the only way to prevent the issue of slavery was to pass the 13th Amendment, which is what President Lincoln got Congress to do as it was becoming more obvious that the northern states were going to be victorious.
Next, Freedmen's Bureau, which originated on March 3rd of 1865, was an agency of early Reconstruction assisting freedmen in the South.
Lastly, Black Codes from 1865 to 1866, law that dominated the behavior of African Americans, was a response to the 13th Amendment and the emancipation of slaves, enacted by southern states in the aftermath of the Civil War. Black Codes aimed to control and restrict the rights and freedoms of African Americans by various factors.
The Black Codes limited the newly freed African Americans. Initially, the 13th Amendment had formally ended slavery and forced labor, except in cases where it was used as a punishment for a crime. This represented a significant change in the legal standing of African Americans, giving them more autonomy than ever before. In response, the southern states found ways to maintain control over the newly freed population.
In addition, Black Codes maintained control from white people. The Black Codes were designed to make sure that African Americans remained under the social, economic, and political control of white Southerners. They aimed to preserve the racial hierarchy and power structures that had existed under slavery. Moreover, there were violence and intimidation from the South. The white supremacist group, the Ku Klux Klan, was established after the end of the Civil War with the purpose of suppressing the rights and liberties of African Americans. For instance, the Ku Klux Klan prevented formerly enslaved African American men from voting through violence and murders, especially targeting the black office holders and their supporters. However, later in 1870, Congress passed the Enforcement Act to protect freedmen against violence.
Lastly, there were unfair labor contracts for African Americans during the Black Codes. The Southerners required them to sign labor contracts or work for specific employers. And if they refused to sign the contracts, they were arrested, fined, and forced into labor, which created very similar conditions to slavery.
Welcome back to Season 3, Reconstruction. In this episode, we will look into the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment dealt with many aspects of citizenship and civil rights. We will talk about how numerous laws passed down repelled the statements made in the amendment.
To start off with, the 14th Amendment was passed in 1866 and ratified in 1868. This amendment was extremely important because the United States was trying to rebuild their country to protect African American individuals who had recently been freed from slavery. The 14th Amendment guaranteed equal rights and equal protection for all citizens, no matter their race or ethnicity. It was specifically needed to make sure that the informally enslaved African Americans were granted citizenship rights.
However, after the amendment was made, it was not always applied.
Why not? I don't understand. Can you give me a for instance?
For instance, 9 years after the amendment was passed, the Supreme Court struck down the Civil Rights Act in 1875.
Why did they strike it down? That doesn't even make sense.
This was because Congress believed that they did not have the authority to prevent discrimination within private individuals and conditions. Thereafter, African American individuals were asked to seek relief from state governments rather than federal governments. When slavery was banished, previously enslaved African Americans began to move to big cities in the South in the 1880s to seek more amounts of freedom. However, as we see in the Civil Rights Act being struck down, it may no longer be slavery, but it is still not exactly called freedom. This meant a limit of their opportunities in their cities.
As we can see, the United States seems to twist their new rules to violate the 14th Amendment.
Wait, but what happened when the act was struck down?
After the act was struck down, this idea of separate but equal was built, where the different races would be separated but with an equal amount of facilities. However, this was the complete opposite of the purpose of the 14th Amendment. The state governments began to arrange a system of inequality between the races, which separated schools and public and semi-public facilities.
In 1887, the violations under individuals with different racial and ethnic backgrounds began to get worse and worse. The 1887 Florida law required railroads to be separated for the accommodations of each race. This meant that people of different races were meant to be separated.
I know this. This is called the Louisiana Separate Car Act.
Yeah, you're right, Isabella. In May 23, 1896, the Weekly Messenger, which was a publishing company at this time period, talked about the Separate Car Act. They stated that the Supreme Court of the United States yesterday rendered a decision in which the law of the state of Louisiana requiring railroad companies in the state to supply separate coaches for white and colored persons is pronounced to be constitutional. There was only one dissenting voice, that of Justice Harlan, and thus is removed the hope of the African American to be allowed to mix freely while and transmit from place to place with the Caucasian.
During this time of shocking historical events, an important figure arose, Homer Plessy.
Who's Homer Plessy?
Homer Plessy, who was a mix of white and black ancestry, got arrested in 1892. He was arrested because he seated himself in the white compartment of the train, while it was against the Louisiana Separate Car Act. He was challenged by the conductor of the train and got arrested.
During the case, Judge John Howard Ferguson ruled against Plessy, which is why the case became the name of Plessy v. Ferguson. Despite Homer Plessy's efforts of overturning the Louisiana Separate Car Act, he still lost against the case. This was because the Supreme Court stated that it did not violate the 14th Amendment since facilities were equal.
In the same newspaper, the Weekly Messenger also stated the lowest court ruled in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson that there was no discrimination against the African American if he afforded equal accommodations with the white man. However, this was clearly not true. In the end, the Plessy versus Ferguson case led to strengthening racial segregation throughout the United States.
As racial segregation spread throughout the United States, the Jim Crow laws also began to expand. Jim Crow laws were building on the idea of separate but equal. They separated public parks, schools, and theaters of white and black people. This law also forbid interracial marriages.
In conclusion, yes, the 14th Amendment was necessary for the United States to make right after the abolishment of slavery. But there were many ways the state governments violated the 14th Amendment.
Although the 14th Amendment attempted to create equality to marginalized groups, the amendment proved not to be an improvement for the Reconstruction period in the United States because the state governments continuously found ways to work around and violate the rights of marginalized groups, rather than working on unifying all individuals in the country to provide equality for all.
Welcome back to Season 3 podcast on the Reconstruction period. I'm Emily, and this is our third and final episode. Let's begin.
According to the 15th Amendment, the rights of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. What did they mean by this?
In simpler words, the 15th Amendment gave black men the right to vote, but this constitutional right was often violated. Firstly, we should first establish why the right to vote is so important. That is because this right provides political representation to different kinds of citizens, and because voting rights is the basis of democracy.
So in continuation with our previous episodes, the 13th and 14th Amendments had established that slavery was legally abolished in the United States, and all people born or naturalized in the country were citizens.
Yeah, and in 1867, the Reconstruction Acts called for African American suffrage in the South. However, many states prevented black people from voting. In response to this resistance, Congress passed the 15th Amendment. They also ruled that if the Southern states wanted to rejoin the Union, they would have to ratify the Reconstruction Amendment. And thus, black men had the constitutional right to vote by 1870.
In the 1880s, many black men exercised their voting rights and even held office. In the 1890s, however, Southern states found a way to prevent black suffrage using the previously mentioned Jim Crow laws and the grandfather clauses. Under the grandfather clauses, those who had the right to vote before 1866 and their descendants were exempted from educational, property, and tax requirements for voting. The Southern states specifically picked the date 1866 because it was when the 13th Amendment was ratified. Thus, black men were prevented from voting just because their fathers and grandfathers had been enslaved.
Many years later, in 1915, the Supreme Court ruled that the grandfather clauses were unconstitutional and violated the 15th Amendment. But the federal government was not able to fully end this practice until the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which abolished racial discrimination in voting.
Thus, although the 15th Amendment seemed to give black men the right to vote, African Americans had to struggle for another century before they were able to exercise their rights without restrictions. During the Reconstruction period, some ways that Americans fought for civil rights was through organizations and education systems. The NAACP is the United States' largest and most widely recognized civil rights organization today. It was founded in 1909 as a response to the Springfield Race Riots of 1908. In the riots, a mob of about 5,000 white people killed African Americans, burned down their homes, and drove many black people out of the city.
We will now read an excerpt from Race Riots in Illinois, a news article by The Independent in 1908. Later in the day, Charles Hunter, an African American, was lynched by the mob, and in the evening, George Donegan, an aged and respected African American, was taken from his house, brutally beaten, and hanged. The charge against him was that he had a white wife. Many of the injured were wounded by militia, some by the mob, others by African Americans defending their homes. More than 2,000 African Americans have fled from the city. Hundreds are sheltered and protected by soldiers in their camps.
The Springfield riot demonstrated how racial equality is vital to maintaining a safe and stable society. Without it, innocent citizens were hurt due to the hate and mob mentality of the race riot. As a result of the Springfield riots, an interracial group, which included W.E.B. Du Bois, a famous civil rights activist, came together to form the NAACP. This organization played an important role in the civil rights movement and helped outlaw many discriminatory practices across the country, such as segregation in public schools.
During the Reconstruction period, most colleges and universities prohibited African Americans from attending. Because of this, HBCU was founded to provide higher education and better opportunities for African American students. HBCU still exists today. The oldest HBCU is the Methodist Episcopal Church, which helped educate African Americans who had escaped slavery in the South using the Underground Railroad.
In conclusion, the Reconstruction Amendments, consisting of the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendments, aim to give greater civil rights and equality to all African American citizens. The 13th abolished slavery, the 14th granted citizenship to the newly freed people, and the 15th established the right to vote regardless of race.
Despite these constitutional changes, African Americans face violations of their rights through measures like Black Codes, Plessy v. Ferguson, Jim Crow laws, and the Grandfather Clauses.
Race riots broke out because of opposition to the Reconstruction, and this happened not just in Springfield, Illinois, but across the whole country.
Yeah, so how much did the Reconstruction period really improve the lives of African Americans?
While the Reconstruction era somewhat brought improvements to the lives of African Americans, it was far from being perfect.
By 1916, the end of our Season 3 episode, racial equality has not been fully achieved.
The Reconstruction did change the country, but it was just another step in the fight for equality.